I'll make the bolder statement that Ukraine achieves victory in a matter of months and not years.
What if there's 10,000 troops mechanized with a little armored tip, which is what they used up in Kharkiv? What if that's waiting? And if they did have that, what would they use it for before the winter?
Russia wants Ukraine to temporarily halt. It wants them to solidify the lines, to give them time to reconsolidate like they did between April and May.
So I do think that this is the point at which historians will look at it and go, that was when the war started to end.
Today, I'm speaking with Mike Martin and John Spencer, who are both prominent commentators on the invasion of Ukraine and need little introduction. They have both appeared on the Voices of War in the past, and you can find links in the show notes to those previous discussions. They join me today for an update on the situation in Ukraine. Mike is joining us from London and John from his home in Colorado Springs. Gentlemen, welcome back to the Voices of War.
Hello, mate.
Hey, thanks, Mage. Thanks for having me back.
Gentlemen, just to timestamp this conversation, we're recording this just after 9 p.m. on the evening of 22nd of September in Ukraine time. There is lots to cover and our time is rather short, so we'll get straight into it. Maybe, Mike, we'll start with you. Can you give us a brief summary of what you see happening in Ukraine at the moment?
So over the last 10 days, over the last fortnight, Russia has suffered its second big reversal. So the first one was in April when they withdrew their troops from around Kyiv and went back into Belarus. And that was kind of them accepting that they weren't going to decapitate the Ukrainian government. And then we've just seen this second one where the Ukrainians punched through the Russian lines and took out lots of their logistics and basically caused the whole front line to collapse. And whilst they've been doing that, they've also been pushing ahead with their offensive in the south toward Kherson, which is obviously in the direction of Crimea. The Russian strategic center of gravity, tied up lots of Russian troops down there. And since that, the offensive probably took 9,000 square kilometers or something, huge amounts of territory.
It's massive.
Huge amounts of territory. And actually, since then, the Russians haven't been able to stabilize their front line. Like, they tried to stabilize it on a river called the River Oskol, but the Ukrainians have crossed that in several places. And now the Ukrainians have got back into Luhansk. So you remember about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, the Russians announced, we've got Luhansk. That's one of the two. We just need to get Donetsk and then we're done with our war here. So it's been a real disaster. They've had an entire formation wiped out, the First Guards tank army.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like losing, I don't know.
And this is sort of an elite unit, at least. That's what they like to call it, at least.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the
word
word
like the 16th para.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, elite's kind of thrown around a lot, but it's like a whole named unit that's got a kind of folklore about it gone.
Yeah.
And the stories that we hear are of Russian troops changing their uniforms, running away, abandoning loads of equipment. And the Ukrainians, ever masterful on info ops, are tweeting, we'd like to thank the Russians for their latest arms deliveries, for our war effort. It's been a disaster for Russia. And it's not over yet. They haven't stabilized that front line. They haven't got the troops. They've lost loads of equipment. Watch this space.
John, what's it looking like from you? I not only suspect, but I know you're pretty closely tapped into the tactical situation on the ground. What's it looking like from your end?
Well, I mean, I agree with Mike. I mean, it looks like the second biggest defeat of the Russian military on the field of battle since their abandonment of their primary strategic objective, which is regime change in Ukraine, taking the capital city. Now, as a kind of a tactical guy, I also look at what we're seeing in the areas that are being taken, right? Not just the abandoned equipment, but the quality of the equipment, the order and discipline of the troops that we're seeing, which I think even surprised, to be honest, Ukrainians. One that what was left, right? Some of the Rosguardia, some of the LPR, DPR, when faced with any resistance, that just folded, but also the state that they were living in and the quality of the positions. And I agree with Mike. There's lots of fighting happening, but trying to connect strategy down to tactics. But also the last couple of days, I know we'll get into it, the announcements coming out of the Kremlin are a very big sign on how's it going.
Well, let's get into that now, because that is the kind of most prominent topic at the moment. Putin's partial mobilization of allegedly 300,000 reserves. What do you make of this move? And who are these poor conscripts? And I think we're seeing images of that emerging now as to who they actually are. But what's the likely impact? Maybe, over to you, John.
So what is it, right? So it's call up of up to 30,000, what they call reserves. They don't have like a reserve like what us in the West would think of, like units that train regularly or anything. These are younger personnel who have served some amount of time and done their mandatory service that were sent notices, report back to duty. You'll be given 2 weeks of refresher training and then sent straight to the front line, which is just crazy because you think about what we're seeing about the front line, and you're just going to flow people in.
It's literally
most of us that understand. Literally cannon fodder, because how do you do mass mobilizations? One, you spin up your country and create the infrastructure to receive, even if it's somebody who served in the military 2 or 4 years, and you create new units or you create soldiers ready to plug into units. Russia doesn't have the capacity and infrastructure to do that. They're literally, and we've seen videos this morning of them putting them on buses. They're going to bus them somewhere, and then somehow, if they can logistically, get them to these BTGs and these units that are already in such poor quality. I know Mike and Why We Fight will want to touch on what does it look like when you take somebody, conscript is kind of used kind of overall, like people talk about conscripts, and sometimes that's a mandatory service. They still showed up to serve. But when you start drafting people, which is what this is, although it's of people who have served before, that's what they call it, reserves. Russia just started the draft, which it hasn't had to do since World War II. So it's significant because what they also did was stop loss the conscripts that are currently in from leaving.
That's right.
So these guys who served, I can tell you, even from a very highly motivated professional unit, when you receive people that are forced into service or who are forced not to be let go, if you didn't have problems already, which the Russians do, they're going to have a lot of soldiering problems. If you know what I mean.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And it's not, there's actually a kind of patchwork quilt of Russian military force in Ukraine. So you've got the kind of professional army, which one assumes these recruits are going to flow into. You've got the Wagner,
the big assumption
PMC,
by now, isn't
it? Well, because it's not clear, right? So here are the current force providers. So you've got the Russian army, you've got the Wagner group, the PMCs, and we've seen videos of them recruiting prisoners recently. And also reports of when they get to the front line, they just surrender immediately because that gets them out of their 23-year prison term in Russia. Then you've got the Chechens, and there's another guy I can't remember beginning with P who's got his own little private army. So you basically got a bunch of private armies, basically another oligarch. So you've got a bunch of private armies in Ukraine, and they don't speak to each other. There's not a unified chain of command. And, Putin, we hear today, Putin's reaching right down to the battlefield to talk to tactical or operational commanders to command them. That's rather insane. Than so that whole strategic layer of Russian command is missing. Into that, you're going to inject what? A bunch of guys who have had 2 weeks training. By the way, most of the training battalions are in Ukraine already. So the trainers are either dead or they're fighting. Already the soldiers are not equipped well and the logistics system is broken. So I saw someone say on Twitter, I was very apt, 100 men can run away at the same speed as 10 men, but they eat 10 times as much food.
But I mean, we're obviously laughing at this, but it seems ludicrous what we're seeing. And there's also the added layer that again is emerging now, that there's mainly minorities across Russia from the poor areas that are being dragged into this. Undoubtedly, this is going
Siberia.
It's just insane from some of the poorest, regions, which is in every war, really, right? It's going to be, your minorities that are really going to go and serve, but that's undoubtedly going to start having some sort of corroding effect from those areas when all of their men all of a sudden are going to fight for a war for a leader who not necessarily held in good light by them anyway.
No, this is not actually about generating military capability because, you either take a long time developing these reservists and they go there, fighting fit in 6 months or 3 months, whether, or, as John said, you put them through a 2-week training course and they're just cannon fodder. I mean, either way, they don't generate military capability in the timeframes that you need it. So what's going on? Well, since the failure of this Kharkiv, the Russian collapse at the hands of this Ukrainian offensive, Putin's been taking a lot of flack. And all of these right-wing, ultra-nationalist headbangers on all the talk shows are giving him loads of flack. And his fingerprints are all over this war. This is Putin's war.
Yeah.
And they've been calling for, nuclear annihilation of the West, dropping nuclear bombs on London and Berlin, and mobilization of the whole country, and, total war and all that kind of stuff. So what this is I think, it's not a total mobilization, because that would cause, lots of problems like you're saying. It's a partial mobilization as a sop to the right wing to say, look, I'm doing something, I'm getting everything going, but it's not going to deliver any military capability. And hopefully it's not extensive enough to, it's not civilians, it's reservists or whatever. Hopefully not extensive enough to really get people, revolting.
And it's not the Russian middle class, right? It's not Moscow that's being sent to the front. As much as there's now more and more protests. Have you any thoughts on that? John, I see you nodding. Any thoughts to Mike's previous comments or the protests in Russia?
I mean, I think it also, this is all wars, politics by other means. This is clearly through the advice and the chess game for Russia, but there is a global perception of that action that Putin is having to take, that he even said on public TV he would not do, the call for the reserves for his special military operation, is a sign of defeat. There is an element of desperation. And I think the protests, although we all know that they're not big enough to have a real impact, but they're significant. And maybe it's just a little crack in whether it's the sold out flights immediately out of Russia or the Googling of how to get out of Russia or how to break my arm.
Yeah.
I mean, all these things are small snippet signs of it ain't going well for the Russian soldiers in Ukraine or the Russian Putin regime, for sure.
What did you make of the way Putin was treated in Uzbekistan last week as well by leaders who otherwise should be bowing to him? But of course, then we saw, Erdogan and Modi make it quite clear as to where they consider Russia to be at the moment. Any thoughts on that?
I think I don't know. It might be a bit bold, but I think you can argue that we're actually seeing the beginning of the end of the war. Significant military defeats for Russia on the battlefield. We've just spoken about this kind of threat to Putin's right flank that he's trying to deal with. So he's got domestic troubles, right? And then Modi says to him, don't forget Modi and Russia, India and Russia go back a long way. India's been buying all the oil during the war. Modi said, 2022, we shouldn't be settling things with war. Putin says in public to Xi. Now, imagine what's actually been said in private if this was said in public. We understand, President Xi, that you have concerns and questions about the war, and I will hope to solve some of those questions for you. Erdogan, president of Turkey, who has been playing this very clever bridging role between Ukraine and Russia. They organised that grain deal with Guterres, the UN Secretary General. He said Crimea should go back to its rightful owners.
Yeah, that was huge. Yeah.
I mean, this is absolutely nuts. So what everyone has seen with what the Ukrainians have demonstrated with that offensive, this is a great sort of example of how the tactical/operational war affects the strategic. Is the Ukrainians handed the Russians arses to them on a plate on the battlefield, and suddenly the international environment shifted and people realized that Russia was going to lose the war. I mean, actually, if you've been studying the war, it's pretty obvious they were going to lose it right from the beginning. But suddenly a load of people have gone, oh my God, they're going to lose the war. And look at them. They're all realigning themselves. Realigning themselves to be on the winning side, the winning international coalition. So I do think that this is the point at which historians will look at it and go, that was when the war started to end.
John, any comments?
Yeah, I 100% agree. Especially when you talk about massive wars, the allies matter, whether they're silent allies or they're vocal allies, right? Well, I think another point that I was extremely surprised, and like some of my friends at RUSI, when Russia has to go to North Korea for artillery rounds. Like that should have been it's almost comical, but that blew our mind as we all thought like they had these Soviet stockpiles of tanks and artillery guns and artillery rounds. Like that was one of the first signs, and that was even before they got completely defeated in detail. I mean, they actually got outthought. If you look at the operational campaign and the Kherson offensive, and the Russians were maneuvering a force towards Kherson. One, it's about operational mobility. They were just going too slow. And then the Ukrainians had better intelligence, capitalized on a weakness in the Kharkiv front, and just kept going. And like Mike said, they're not done yet. But yeah, when you go to North Korea for your artillery rounds, and have to go to Iran for your drones,
and your prisons,
it ain't going well. But your prisons, and those are legit. I mean, it's just insane. But I agree. I personally, you don't like to say this, right? Because how much fighting's still done, right? These 30,000 or whatever men are going to reach the Ukraine territories, Ukraine sovereign land, and they're going to be forced to do something. They're just going to die. So there's still fighting to be done, especially to take back areas of Luhansk and Donetsk that have been in Russian control for a long time. I used to say, the whole Stalin quote where their quantity has its own quality. But in this case, Russia's too far gone to add just men to this equation, right? You can break that down by all the combat arms, right? Tanks, artillery, like just adding people isn't the solution to the problem.
It's such a great quote, isn't it? Because actually that's what they've tried to do. They've tried to fight a Soviet style of warfare. But the difference is that the Soviets in World War II had a 6 million person army. That's what, when Stalin said quantity, that's what he meant. That's quantity, right? And they didn't even have enough. Famously, one rifle between two, off you go. When the Ukrainian rifle gets killed, the other one picks it up, right? But that's not quantity. They're talking about a few 100,000 at most. They started the war with between 150 and 200. That's not quantity. That would be, the Soviet troops in a tiny sector of the front. It's a completely different. They probably had more motorcyclists than that in the Soviet army in the Second World War.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And it's also completely two competing ways to fight war. It's trying to flood the front lines with men in this kind of classic attrition style warfare against decentralized command, highly motivated troops, highly trained troops that are really embracing maneuverist warfare. And we're seeing the results. I mean, like you were saying before, an entire formation to just delete it from the battlefield. I mean, that shows you the different level of tactical skill or martial skill, really. I'm sorry, John, you were about to say something as well. I think
I 100% agree. I mean, Putin does not have a Red Army, not even in moral, in the fight of the soldier, right? He can't call upon this great reserve of people willing to die for the motherland, because that's not what this is about. Ukraine has the advantage in every measure of warfighting, except number of people. And arguably, we could actually argue, because nobody knows the true number of the Ukrainian fighting force, because even in its offensive, we've seen regular army, Ukrainian army, we've seen Ukrainian National Guard, territorial defenses. They're combining the Legion. I don't even know if they're outnumbered.
And they've got a nation, right? They've got an entire nation to fight.
Yeah, that's absolutely. The nature of maneuver warfare, right? The nature of maneuver warfare is you move your troops around, so you create local overmatch. So even if there's more Russian troops in Ukraine than the Ukrainians, which I severely doubt, because like you say, it's the whole nation fighting, because they're much more mobile. They're much, as John was saying, they're outthinking the Russians. They're achieving local concentrations that enables them to punch through, collapse the logistics. Therefore, the whole front collapses, and then those troops will just move somewhere else and repeat the trick again.
Yeah, I actually feel like it's like Putin's a kid saying, "Won't you just fight me the way I want you to fight me? Like, come at me." You're like, I need. You're literally living in the old world where he had no military experience. That's it. Right. Fight me. Like, no, I'm going to just strike your force behind you. Like literally. And then I'm going to put your soldiers to the test. And when they're soldiers, literally think about every battle that's happened so far outside of the small massing effort that they did in May, June around, Severodonetsk, to take that part of Luhansk, they can't adapt. They want to fight attrition. They want to fight mass on mass. And the Ukrainians won't give them that. Like Mike said, they have better intelligence and they'll move faster. Now they have better weapons, not just including the MLRS or the artillery, just the counter battery and the harm missile. They're just eroding the Russian military piece by piece.
Yeah. And I definitely want to get to the weapons piece as well. And this is one of the most prominent questions asked, by the audience as well. But just one thing that I want to pick up on, and that's the referendums that Putin has called, and just tie them in, because I think they are also significant indicators of what potentially Putin's strategic aims might be by this point. What do you make of these? I mean, they're laughable by the rest of the world, but what do you make of these referendums? John, do you have any points? I have my own thoughts, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, John.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's what the Putin regime needs to do to fit the narrative of defending Russian territory. He wants to rush a vote, but it's comical because he literally wants to rush a vote to areas that he doesn't currently control militarily, like all of the Luhansk region. Not just talking about cities. He wants to do a referendum of Luhansk, 4 oblasts that he doesn't even militarily control, maybe Donetsk, and then hold a vote, and then by constitution is already set up. Once it happens constitutionally, it in their marker becomes Russian territory, which then they can use self-defense as their justification for their actions. He's almost setting up his next act of desperation if he can stage this vote, which is clearly what happens. It gets staged. Like if it was any type of legitimacy, like invite some international arbitrator to the
observers.
Vote. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting how people who clearly don't believe in democracy feel the need to have votes to validate their position? Because, Putin's had loads of elections in Russia, which he keeps on winning, right? I just find it really interesting. If they're so convinced of their own, they clearly do feel a weakness or an inferiority complex towards democracy, surely, because otherwise why would they be having these referendums?
Yeah,
and he's actually losing the people. Even in Kherson, where he, that was one of the first areas seized in March. There was a chance where if you could have staged it, he had such control of the area at that moment that it would have not been as laughable. But now you have a vibrant partisan actions happening in these areas, where literally like people who've been assigned to control the areas are ending up dead, attacks, bombings, you name it. And I think that's only going to increase, which just furthers that this isn't about liberating Russian people, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah. And I think it also ties in the potential 300,000 recruits that he's trying to mobilize. And I've read this commentary elsewhere, but and of course we know that these referendums will be in the affirmative for Russia, along the lines of 96%, 88%, want to be part of Russia. And I read comments of some pundit on Twitter, that these numbers are already known somewhere. They're in a file somewhere, undoubtedly. They'll be rolled out over the weekend. But what's interesting is then potentially is about this, winter's around the corner. It's about, setting in and digging in and using these additional troops to basically go and fill sandbags and fortify the positions and fortify the newly Russian lands.
Is the target audience the domestic? Is it the domestic audience in Russia? Is that the main target audience for it, to gain further support for the war at home, to stop that support slipping,
and to not risk the 60% of apathetic Russians jumping on board and saying, hey, we actually don't support this war, when now you have referendum numbers. Oh, well, these people actually want to be Russians. Fine, let's just carry on with our blissful life of irrelevance.
Yeah.
That was at least my reading of it. Any comments before we move on?
No, I think I always I'm an old soldier. It's needed in his political calculus, but I think he's also understands he doesn't have the soul of the soldier to fight, and this would just be part of that narrative. Why are you fighting? Right? Answer the why. I'm fighting for my fellow countrymen to be free, and they see as they occupy these areas, and what we've seen they have done to their people, like the people they are liberating, then why are they committing these genocides in these areas? It just all starts to unravel. But I see it as also a way, like these new people, like give them the why, because I'm sure there's talks that they have to have, like, okay, this is why I'm asking you to sacrifice. But war puts that to the test, and winter's coming, and that's going to put that. Why are you there to test?
Yeah, undoubtedly. Which I think is a neat segue as well into the next segment I want to cover, and that's well, firstly, what can Ukraine do next, given that winter is around the corner? But we do also know that Ukraine might not be finished. They might not be finished with their plans or exploiting the current weaknesses. So, from your perspectives, what do you see as happening next? Maybe over to John first.
Sure. So I agree with you that. Because the line started collapsing so rapidly, it's hard to tell where to consolidate your gains and versus keep exploiting weaknesses. So this is what I strongly believe will happen. Of course, Ukraine will have to consolidate its gains. It can do that much easier because of things like territorial defenses. They're liberating their lands, and they're doing work. They're literally fighting my proverbial 3-block wars. They liberate an area, then they immediately start all the humanitarian aid and pension paying and all that stuff. That's time consuming, but Russia wants Ukraine to temporarily halt. It wants them to solidify the lines, to give them time to reconsolidate like they did between April and May timeframe. And people believe that the weather will do that for it. I personally think that Ukraine is already planning its next moves. It will take Kherson, and it will it will slow momentum, right? The winter weather, it will slow momentum, but it won't stop the momentum by far. I think Ukrainians are going to keep pushing. That Western aid, more packages being announced, more stuff being delivered, more soldiers being trained in places like the UK and Poland. They're getting stronger, but they are having to control, basically spread out and control more territory, but they're getting stronger. And I think that the Russians are hoping that the winter slows things down for them. And I don't think they will. I think the Ukrainians will keep attacking them, and that's what I would do.
I found it interesting as well that President Zelensky actually made that point in his address to the UN General Assembly. He publicly called out and shamed Putin, basically saying he wants a pause. He wants us to stop so he can, rebuild and attack again in the spring, which I thought was a rather brave move.
That's why I think the next moment in this victory for Ukraine will be the reclaiming of areas that were controlled before February 24th, whether that's the city of Luhansk or full control of Donetsk. Those are going to be the next, I think, major moments is when they reclaim territory that's been occupied for 8 years or more.
What do you reckon, Mike?
Well, I've got a bit of I'm sort of, if I were the Ukrainians, what would I do? I totally agree with John about this. Where do they, both sides are kind of nibbling at each other in the northeast to try and work out where to set the new front line. And that looks like it's continuing. The Russians are finding it hard to stabilize. The Ukrainians are working out exactly how far to extend themselves. But I think there's a really interesting question. John said earlier, we don't really know how many Ukrainian soldiers there are. So what if there's a strategic reserve? What if there's 10,000 troops, mechanized, with a little armored tip, which is what they used up in Kharkiv? What if that's waiting, right? And if they did have that, what would they use it for before the winter? And what I'd use it for before the winter is retaking, say, Mariupol, or Melitopol, or something along the Black Sea coast to basically. At the moment, the Russians have got the loads in the east, and they've got Crimea and Kherson, but they've got this little strip along the Black Sea coast that connects it. So I would just sever that, and then we'll settle in for winter. Because that's how they move troops backwards and forwards. So, throughout the war, the Russians have suffered from the extended supply lines. Because if you think about it, the Ukrainians are fighting on the inside of a circle. So if they need to move troops around, it's just moving across the inside of the circle. Because if the Russians are trying to fight the war, and they want to move troops from from the far northeast to the south, they have to go all the way around the circle. So it takes much, much, much longer to reinforce. There's a huge inbuilt advantage that Ukrainians have. But why not make that even worse and just sever the two bits that are currently connected? So the East suddenly becomes one war, and then the South becomes another war. And if you really want to cut the South off, then you take out the Kerch Bridge, right? If you're in Mariupol, your HIMARS might have enough range to hit the Kerch Bridge, which is a bridge that connects Crimea, the eastern bit of Crimea, across to Russia. So, I think there's some bold stuff going on. Whether they've got the troops to take advantage of it, you could really be quite imaginative. They have been so far.
And they have absolutely the initiative and the world on side. Again, just a small, simple figure of the momentum they've got is 101 nations voted in support of having Zelensky address the UN General Assembly, and only 7 didn't. And those 7 are your stock standards, your North Koreas, your Irans, Syria. I mean, unsurprising at all. So one prominent question that keeps popping up is why is the US refusing to give Ukraine ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System? Any thoughts on that from either of you? Because many are saying that this could be the decisive change if they were given such weapon systems with such significantly increased range. So what's your thoughts? Maybe John, then Mike?
Sure. So, I mean, why aren't they? I mean, why didn't they supply some weapons earlier? It's a group, National Security Council decision weighing risk and benefits. Some of it's, in my opinion, not fear-based, but a concern about allowing Putin to escalate because he said certain weapons would, in his view, which is just ridiculous. I mean, Ukraine has earned those weapons in how they've used the aid that they've received so far. But here's what I think. Do the Ukrainians need ATACMS to win this war? No. Would it speed operations in their ability to hit deeper into, occupied Ukraine, into key objectives? Yes. But one, keep the aid that is needed, right? Some of this stuff is about bullets, vehicles. That isn't the decisive tool. That isn't saying, I think they deserve it. Some people think they may have variations of it, and there's a reason why there's got to be this plausible deniability. Like, I don't know what blew up the base in Saki, in Crimea. That wasn't us. So I think it's something that we grabbed onto, but I think they should be given any weapon that will help them. So that's my opinion.
Mike, any thoughts?
I think there's two schools of thoughts in Western capitals. One is everyone agrees that Ukraine needs to win the war. By win, I mean evict Russian forces from. But beyond that, there's two schools of thought. One is that if we cause the Russian army to collapse, then that's probably the end of Putin. And that's a good thing. Maybe Russia will break up, so that's a good thing. The other school of thought is if the Russian army collapses and it's caused the end of Putin, God knows what's coming next. There's people to the right of Putin, and these guys are real nut jobs, and I do wonder whether I wonder whether that plays out in the types of weapons that get given, because they're like, well, we want to win not too quickly, because if they win too quickly, then we don't know what's going to come next. So I feel like what weapons supplies comes out of, like all bureaucracies, comes out of a process of horse trading and negotiation between these two camps, which are like, win, it'll be great, and win, it'll be a disaster. And I think you see that in like Macron, President of France, saying, well, we don't want to humiliate Putin. And, there's definitely concern in Europe, certainly amongst European leaders. I don't know so much about what the US think about this, that if Putin loses and Russia breaks up, or someone worse than Putin gets in power, then that will be even more of a headache for us to deal with.
And that's potentially a real possibility. I mean, we kind of, and if you were to judge it by Twitter, the solution to this is give Ukraine all the weapons it can get, decimate Russia, get a coup inside Russia to decapitate Putin. But I think that does forget the reality that, there are still some significant players in Russia who are on the far right and who want total war. It's like in every country in the world, right? They are the most motivated. The far of both spectrums are the most motivated. They're the loudest. They command the most attention. And it's the 60% again that are indifferent the everyday person who's not really wedded either way, they'll just end up being folded by, again, the most powerful voices. Sorry, we're going to say something, mate?
I was going to say that there's 5,000 nuclear weapons in Russia.
Yeah.
And so if there's a coup or some kind of instability, where do they go? What happens with those? Maybe the only thing worse than a strong Russia is a weak Russia.
Yeah. We've kind of seen what happens, what potentially can happen post the fall of Soviet Union of decommissioning nuclear weapons, but it's not necessarily the same world right now.
Well, mate, you're from Bosnia, right? Look at what happened in the Balkans when, a big state that was comprised of different ethnicities came apart. That's still a very, it's a tinderbox.
Yeah,
so what would Russia look like if Russia started to come apart?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and undoubtedly that's got to be a consideration for certainly European leaders, if not global leaders. But also what happens if you leave Russia completely destabilized and there's a China to the south? From the Western perspective, that's
doesn't China just get all Russia's the number one natural resource exporter in the world. A lot of those resources are in the east.
There you go.
Very not population dense at all, but resource rich. And China is population dense, but resource poor. It seems, would China just say thanks very much? I don't know.
It is undoubtedly a scenario that the halls of power in the West ought to be analyzing if they're already not. But I'm sure they already are. I'd be surprised if this wasn't part of the calculus, which is why, again, listening to the Twitter pundits, is always a little bit dangerous. Sorry, noting both of you are those, so I'll take that back.
You've got more faith in the quality. Got more faith in the quality of our leaders than I do.
I have more faith in the quality of our institutions that exist to analyze this. And maybe again, even there, I might be too hopeful. So maybe a last question is to put you both on the spot and kind of call it. What does the next 2 weeks hold? What should we be looking out for? What are some of those indicators and warnings of this, going one way or the other?
So for me, that one's kind of easy. 2 weeks is at this phase of the war is not that much time. I think you're going to continue to see. It'll take over 2 weeks to see where these Russian soldiers are put. 2 weeks of training. Maybe ask me about 2 months from now. It's really, this is like we were talking about, there are things, we didn't even talk about the air campaign, which is very surprising that's happening over Harrison right now. Stuff that we haven't seen in a war before, the number of sorties being flown, things like that. I can't make a prediction of 2 weeks or 2 months from now where that line stabilizes in the east. 2 months from now, I'd call at least the west of the Dnieper clear, in control by Ukrainians. I think that pocket's going to fold personally, just because the Ukrainians spent so many weeks shaping the conditions for that environment. But this is hard. I'll make the bolder statement that Ukraine achieves victory in a matter of months and not years.
Mike, anything from you?
Yeah, I pretty much agree. And the next 2 weeks is, it's going to be hard to. I think probably the most interesting thing to watch is where that front line settles in the northeast. There's not many defensive positions for the Russians if they get pushed off the river Oskil. So where are they going to build that front line? I'd also agree with John that this is the beginning of the end of the war, and we're looking at Russian defeat, I guess, after the spring of next year. But the speed at which their front lines collapse, if Ukraine's got a strategic reserve, they could do it this year.
Great. Gentlemen, on that note, thank you very much. I know it's been a fast and furious discussion, but enjoyable as always. And I'm sure we'll speak again in the near future. Thank you both.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please take a moment to like and review the show wherever you get your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes. Thank you, and until the next time.